Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome Ariane Burke for today's talk in the Human Evolution and the Paleolithic seminar series. Ariane is working at the University of Montreal in the hominin dispersals research group. You're also affiliated with the HEAS Center for Climate Research at the University of Vienna, if I'm right. And Ariane's work centers a lot around how past climate change impacted human populations and human population dynamics. And yeah, so welcome very much to Vienna, and I give the word to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this invitation. I'm looking forward to the Q&A after the presentation. So as was just mentioned, I'm presenting today some of the research that we've been doing with the Hominin Dispersals Research Group, a group that was formed initially many years ago to look at hominin dispersals, as its name suggests, but has drifted over into a bit more of an emphasis on the archaeology of climate change. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's an interdisciplinary field of climate science, and it explores the impact of climate change on the environment and human communities that interact with it. The reason archaeologists have become involved in climate change research is that archaeological data provides very richly contextualized sources of information for studying the interaction between humans and the environment at different timescales and across different spatial scales. Now, these interactions between humans and their environment are increasingly studied using modeling approaches. That's what I'm going to talk about today. For those of you who are more archaeologists and less numerical archaeologists or climate scientists, you might want to consider what we mean by models, because the term tends to be used both to designate formal and informal models. But in all instances, they're conceptual constructs. They're based on scientific theory and/or data. They're embedded in a software setting, they perform manipulations on input data, and they produce output data for the purpose of scientific advancement or policy development. In other words, they allow us to generate multiple hypotheses, which as archaeologists, we can then test using the archaeological and paleontological records. Now, as archaeologists, we've become used to using predictive modeling when conducting surveys, for example, since the late 20th century. And very few archaeologists find that aspect of modeling controversial. Let's have a look at some of the GIS-based models that are deemed to be acceptable by archaeologists. Models of site location, for example. These are predictive models, and they're used in cultural resource management as well as by archaeologists when they're designing surveys. They are the equivalent of species distribution modeling, which is something that is widely used now in ecology and in conservation biology. More recently and more controversially for many archaeologists, machine learning techniques have been developed and are being increasingly used to study human dispersal and population replacement in the past. The result has been, especially in the last decade or so, a plethora of publications proposing different models of the same processes, of the same events. And this has led to some confusion. This is just an example, sort of a collage of some of the 20 or more publications proposing models of human dispersal during the critical time period between 30 and 60,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens left Africa and started dispersing throughout Eurasia, and Neanderthals become extinct. This has raised three questions, which are often discussed and debated, and just briefly to look over them. First of all, what is it that's being modeled? As paleoanthropologists and archaeologists have adopted machine learning and species distribution modeling, or niche modeling, it's become a bit fuzzy. It's a bit unclear as whether we're actually modeling a niche or whether we're not modeling the distribution of the species. It's worth considering what we mean by niche and how the spatial distribution of the species is determined. And it's determined by the interaction with other species, so biotic interactions with vegetation, and also with the environment itself, abiotic interactions, and by their own mobility. And this is described by Sobran and other, Sobran and Peterson, Sobran, other ecologists. The sweet spot in the middle, see if I can get the sweet spot in the middle, I'm using the cursor, it's not really the, could they see that online, do you think? Yeah, okay. Is where these three spheres of interaction intersect, and it reflects where the species is actually likely to be found. Okay, it doesn't mean that they won't be found within their mobility sphere, but they're more likely to be found at where these three types of interaction intersect. Most archaeological and paleoanthropological models don't account for the biotic interactions, and they only describe some of the abiotic interactions. In other words, we're really only describing some components of the niche, and I think it's probably best, as has been suggested by ecologists, to exercise a degree of caution and consider that what we're modeling is in fact species distribution. So I'm going to refer to the models that I'm discussing today as species distribution models. The second question that's raised by the increasing use of modeling in paleoanthropological research is, what is the model comparability? How do we establish intercomparability between the models? And much of the differences, I mean, there are overall similarities between all of them, as there should be. If they weren't similar, we'd be much more worried about the incompatibilities. But the differences that exist are due to model design. So first of all, they're all based at some point on global climate models. So paleoclimatologists produce climate models. These models differ, whether you're using HEAS from Bristol, whether you're using the models from the LSCE in France, whether you're using GEM in Canada. Different forcing mechanisms and different resolution, different spatial and temporal resolution in the global climate models will create differences in the inputs to the species distribution models. Different downscaling methods are used. Different downscaling methods are used because the AOGCM or the global climate models are usually at a fairly coarse scale of spatial resolution, which for archaeological reasons, for the types of questions that archaeologists ask, is too coarse. So we're looking for downscaling. There are different downscaling methods that are that can be used. And then finally, of course, the input data that we select includes the archaeological observations, and how we filter those depends on how we assess the chronological validity of the sites and their chronostratigraphic integrity. It also depends on the predictive variables that we choose, and many models just pick fairly simple climate predictors, for example, average temperature, the coldest month, etc. So it's a fairly restricted set of variables that went into the earlier models. This is obviously no longer the case as people adopt more complex modeling solutions. These modeling solutions rely on a type of algorithm. The choice of algorithm, again, is going to produce some differences. They have different sensitivities to aspects of all of the above. Random forest is the one that I'm going to be talking about today. Maximum entropy, or max-ent, generalized linear modeling, boosted regression trees, etc. So there are different algorithms. They're actually largely comparable, and there's been quite a bit of work done in ecology to compare them. But they do produce somewhat different results. Again, it will depend on which predictive variables are being employed and how sensitive the models are to them. Finally, and what has become apparent to people doing climate science, so for the archaeology of climate change, for example, we're increasingly aware of the necessity of developing an integrated approach to the study of human-environment interactions. In other words, not just modeling interactions with environmental factors, but also considering how the archaeological record can best be used to inform these models, and also how paleoanthropological and archaeological theory can inform the selection of the predictors. So the theoretical basis on which the modeling design is done can also be improved. So to this third point, we aren't the only group that has recently published an article basically saying we need to integrate the workflow and more profitably look at phase 4. Now, we haven't gotten that far yet, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a later slide. But what we have done, and what I am going to discuss today, is gotten through to phase 3 and are now considering the connector, in fact, between how the environment driven by climate change, how climate change is driving transformations in the environment, the structure of the environment, how this structures the distribution of human populations, thus structuring their social networks, how that creates a situation where cumulative culture theory can inform us as to rates of cultural innovation, rates of cultural transmission, and cultural evolution. So we're concentrating on that at the moment, or we're intending to once we've worked our way through phases 1, 2, and the beginning of phase 3. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So climate drives environmental structure, influences the population structure. You can use species distribution modeling to predict what the population structure might look like. And in particular, and this is where we've pushed things a little further than we had in the past, there are GIS tools that have been developed in conservation ecology that help us predict where human territories are likely to have been and how well connected they are, because that will allow us to evoke cultural evolutionary theory and suggest a link to cultural evolution. So I'm going to be drawing from a recent publication itself based on the past 6 years or more of research on habitat suitability modeling, and then pushing it a little bit further. So in phase 1, archaeological sites, their chronological their chronostratigraphy, their chronological validity is assessed. We have to try to find accurate locations, and we're going to use these as input in conjunction with the climate modeling that was done at the LSCE. And we're using them to create species distribution models. So first of all, the climate models simulate conditions for target time slices. And in our case, we're looking at that period between 30 and 60,000 years ago. And we've grouped the sites into stadial and interstadial conditions. We're doing the same with the climate models, produced 2 climate models, one for sort of archetypal climate models for GS and GI. It would be possible to add vegetation. We haven't done that in our models, but of course one can do that. And there are other teams that are working on modeling large herbivores, for example, and adding that as a variable to their models. So it's possible to improve on our models by adding more biotic variables. We derive topographic variables from a DEM. Again, another modification that could be brought is better modeling of pre-existing topographic conditions. It's actually quite a computationally expensive thing to do. So we used modern DEM. And the archaeological sites are assigned to the target time slices after applying chronological filters, and they're treated as observations in a classic species distribution model. We chose to use random forest, and we make iterative use of random forest. So random forest is, it's a bagging method. It's not, it's commonly used. Sorry, I don't have my speaker notes. I'm trying to say this as succinctly as possible. But it's a statistical method for establishing what conditions together, so what combination of conditions reflect the location of archaeological sites. And this model is then applied to geographic space, producing a habitat suitability model. We use it iteratively, both to select variables and to select the best model. So that means that we run first with however many variables we select. We had 36 predictors at the onset. And at each run of 100 forests, so we create 10,000 forests by the end of the runs. We've got the average results. We look at the best model. We knock out the 20 weakest performing predictors, and we run the model again. And we do this several times, basically until exhaustion. And then we select the model that has the best performance index. These are the results. They're previously published by Simon Paquin and Ben Albouy as part of their thesis research. I've been just pointing out that red is highly suitable habitat and green is less suitable habitat. And this pattern is pretty intuitive given the location of the Fennoscandian and alpine ice sheets. So these are the geographic projections or habitat suitability models that come from the species distribution model. So what we did in our most recent publication is take these SDMs and compare them, do a comparative analysis of the availability of suitable habitat for Neanderthals and for sapiens during stadial and interstadial events, so GIGS events. We're going to start with that, and I'll run you through just a hotspots analysis, which are some of the GIS tools available for analyzing the habitat suitability models. And then we're going to look at some newer tools that we're just applying now, which is the locate region tools and overlay and optimal connection tools. All of this with an aim to understand what the difference might have been between Neanderthals and sapiens, their relative resilience in the face of changing climate, and moving forward, we're hoping to use these models of networks between regions to study the applicability of the cumulative culture theory. So just a straightforward comparison. Here we're looking at the percentage of the spatial domain, the total spatial domain, for bins corresponding to increasingly suitable habitat. In bright red, you've got bright red and orange are the GI events. The bright red is sapiens, the orange is Neanderthal. Similarly, for the cold events, the dark blue is sapiens, the pale blue is Neanderthal. And the one thing that sort of jumps out at you is that sapiens apparently had an advantage during interstadial events. In other words, a larger portion of the available domain was suitable in terms of their habitat preferences than for other species. The other thing we see here is that Neanderthals had a fairly stable pattern. The pale blue and the pale orange lines indicate not a lot of difference in available habitat. That's confirmed when we run a hotspot analysis, which is a statistical tool for identifying significant clusters of either very high or very low habitat suitability values. The highly suitable areas, again, we're looking at the hot colors, and the less suitable areas in blue. Neanderthals are on top, interstadial, stadial, and on the bottom, sapiens, interstadial and stadial. You can see that the hotspot analysis for the Neanderthals is confirming what we saw in the previous graph, which is that there's actually always quite a bit of suitable domain available to Neanderthals, bearing in mind that this is a hotspot analysis. So we're only looking at the most significant clusters of highly suitable habitat. And for sapiens, you see a much more condensed, much more concentrated pattern during stadial events and a more widespread pattern during interstadial events. Now, there's another tool that can be used to analyze the results of the hotspot analysis. It's a comparative tool, produces a variety, at least three main outputs. Just showing you the similarity output here, but what it allows us to do is to compare the hotspot distribution for Neanderthals and sapiens, for stadial on the left and interstadial on the right. And what you see is there's actually quite a bit of similarity, and where those similarities lie, well, intuitively obvious. They lie near in the proximity to Fennoscandian ice sheets, never suitable. One of the things I forgot to mention is that the habitat suitability models themselves consistently showed how important climate variability was to both species in any time frame. In other words, they were avoiding highly variable environments. And I think that's because as hunters and gatherers plan their movement, and their movement is energetically demanding, that they would avoid uncertainty, they would avoid ecological risk. And that's what we see in these hotspots up here, which are the unfavorable areas. What we do also see is that in the very classic Franco-Cantabrian region, there's quite a bit of similarity in the distribution of favorable habitat between Neanderthals and sapiens during stadial events. Remember that that's when the sapiens spatial patterning was much more condensed and centered on this region. And during interstadial events, a little more diffuse, but we still see the importance of this region. So that would be the classic southwestern France, Cantabria, the Ebro Valley, and the Rhone Valley. You can also do pairwise comparisons that show you what the change is. So not just what's similar, but where the changes are. And in bright red, pixels that were less significant that become hot, in other words, that become significant and very favorable, and the bright blue pixels that were not significant but become much less desirable. So it gives you an idea of the change that occurs over time. And I shouldn't have interchanged them, but this time interstadial's on the left, stadial's on the right. And you can see that during the interstadial, you've got areas that were not significant that become quite significant for sapiens. So the implications of some of this, and in the article we go through a few more of the comparisons. Habitat availability for Neanderthal appears to be relatively stable. This counters expectations given derived from archaeological studies that show signs of demographic decline. And it also counters some of the more recent information that the geneticists have been uncovering for loss of genetic diversity in Neanderthal populations. So the archaeological and genetic data lead us to expect that Neanderthal populations were actually in decline. But if we look at the availability of suitable habitat, clearly that doesn't explain that decline. Okay, so there's a disconnect there, which I think indicates that the decline is not based on climate stress. It's based on demographic processes. We also see that the available suitable sapiens habitat is much greater during GI event. Now this meets our expectation that the timing of the dispersals and pulses of dispersal throughout Eurasia were probably timed to the warm events. If we look at the persistent hotspots, those hot areas centered on the Pyrenees, they also extend into the Rhone Valley during stadial events. And there's a second hotspot in southern Iberia, which once again meets the expectations with respect to the location of refugia that result from work that's been done around Gibraltar in southern Iberia. It also meets expectations derived from other models, for example, the one that Colin Wren and I published a number of years ago, suggesting the location of sink and source populations. So source populations from which other regions can be repopulated after climate downturns will be centered around the Pyrenees. Sink populations will be more in those diffuse areas that disappear during stadial events. Now, one of the things that is worth pointing out, and the reason we moved on to start looking at other tools, is that the hotspots analysis by its very nature is really only looking at the maximizing situation. So the largest clusters of highly significant either hot or cold cells. So moving on to looking at regions and connectivity between regions, we decided to build models of the optimal, trying to locate optimal regions or territories within which human groups could exist for either species on the basis of the habitat suitability models. So the two tools that we used are the locate regions tools and the optimal regions connections. Now these, we're using ArcPro, so it's the ESRI product, and the extension is Spatial Analyst. It is possible to program similar tools in R. We just went for the more expedient and available tools to us. So the locate regions tool identifies the best regions or groups of contiguous cells from an input utility, in our case it's habitat suitability, that satisfy a specified evaluation criterion and meet identified shape, size, number, and inter-region distance constraints. Those are the parameters, and I have a slide coming up that re-examines the parameterization of the tool and walks you through them because it's quite critical. The second is the optimal region connectors, which identifies optimal network. The optimal network of least cost paths connect the series of regions once they've been derived. It doesn't create separate paths connecting one location to another, so it's attempting to create networks. That's an important distinction to make. So looking at the locate region tool parameters, the size of the regions that you have to tell the tool what size the regions are, what their shape should be, and the number of regions you're looking for. We chose 2,500 square kilometers, and the next slide will explain why. It's based on ethnoarchaeological research. The shape is spherical because people tend to radiate around archaeological sites and within regions, but we're allowing a distortion based on topography. So we've weighted using habitat suitability, but also topography. The same is true for the connecting step. And for the number of regions, we did a series of tests. Because The exact size of either population at any time is anybody's guess. There've been a series of attempts to calculate the estimated size of the population of Neanderthals or the estimated size of the population of sapiens at specific timeframes, but these have all been actually quite different. So we ran some tests. We looked at 5 region increments, starting with 5, 10, 15, and 20. And we stopped when the background average score of any new region that's added fell or approached the average for the spatial domain or fell below it. In other words, there was nothing to distinguish the new region, quote unquote, from the background. So we're looking to discriminate those parts of the landscape that were more favorable for human suitability, for human habitability. We ended up selecting the 10 region solution. Usually around the 8th or 9th region, the new regions were only slightly better than the background. So you should bear that in mind when we're looking at the next slides. So I was talking about the size, why 2,500? That's based on ethnoarchaeological data. So ethnographically, globally, if we look at hunter-gatherer groups, the social model that's most commonly encountered is hierarchical, and you have nested levels of organization from local to regional to super regional. We're interested in the local and regional populations here. And that is background information. And there was a model of hunter-gatherer territoriality developed by Whalen in 2006 that took into account that ethnographic information and was partly based on Venegar's earlier work on late Paleolithic groups in Western Europe. And he derived a model that suggested that local groups, which are usually 20 to 25 individuals, would have occupied territories about 2,500 square kilometers. And a regional group, which is composed of several local groups, could reach up to 47,500 kilometers. These figures that he suggests are comparable both to ethnographic data and ethnoarchaeological data for hunter-gatherer groups in the Northern Hemisphere, if you exclude those groups that had things, for example, like kayaks and dog sleds. And we checked that with more recent work, for example, Kelly's information, 2013. It also aligns with some, but not all, of the demographic estimates of population sizes during the Paleolithic that were based on the archaeological record. But as I said, these estimates can diverge quite widely. I think more recent work being done by the Cullen group might be well worth examining in the light of this. But my understanding is that they're also interested in Whalen's model. So these are the results for locate regions. If we told the program to select 10 regions, again on top, Neanderthals, interstadial to stadial, and on the bottom, sapiens. You can see that they're pretty much spread around. Each region then will be a territory occupied by a local group. The black dots are the sites that were the observations used to derive the habitat suitability models. And they map onto the hotspots analysis as they should. That's reassuring. But they go beyond it because we're not necessarily only selecting the most optimal regions in terms of habitat suitability, but some of these regions have relatively low average habitat suitability scores, but they're satisfying. So it's allowing for human exploration. It's allowing for human populations to spread out into what are suboptimal, but still good regions to inhabit. So this is already something that we can work with to examine, for example, where the predicted regions for either species might overlap. Because, of course, some of the hypotheses explaining the extinction of the Neanderthals have suggested either that the Neanderthals couldn't outcompete humans and were pushed out of favorable regions, and then failed to adapt to their new reality, or that they were assimilated genetically. So in red, in these maps, again, sapien is the darker color, Neanderthal is the paler color for the warm and the cold events, but the red is where there's an overlay, where the regions overlay. So these are the areas where this analysis suggests that there might have been friction or contact. You can see that during the stadial events, when the sapiens populations contract more, in a more continental pattern, there's way more of these overlapping regions than during the interstadial events, which is interesting because that's also a time when there would have been more environmental stress. Moving on, we use the optimal region connection tools, which is basically least cost pathways, but it takes into account habitat suitability as well as energetic cost of movement across a topographically rugged surface. So we're using slope and habitat suitability. Why habitat suitability? Because these are not A to B trips. These are long, this screen just, okay, no, it just reawoke in itself. People take quite a bit of time to move between these regions, and they need to eat en route. So they will choose routes that are also through suitable habitat. And this also would have channeled their movements when they were doing exploratory moves. Now, what we see here is a relatively better connected network of habitable regions for sapiens than for Neanderthals. And in particular, we see that the Neanderthal metapopulation is clearly spread between two distinct, it's segmented, two distinct regions. We've got east and west populations, which is something that the geneticists have been proposing as well on the basis of their data. So the observations, the sapien regions more interconnected, be it during stadial or interstadial events. Neanderthal metapopulation is more fragmented, which meets the expectations generated by genetic analyses. And we have relatively more overlap occurring during a period of climate stress, that is the cold stadial events, which is where friction and contact, so friction, competition, contact, assimilation, who knows, must have occurred. Some of the general conclusions from this preliminary study then, we agree with other people, including Tom, that population replacement is more complex than we thought, and it occurred over a longer time frame. And in particularly that spatially differentiated combinations of stressors are at play, and we think East and Western Europe are a good example of that, and that there would have been different stresses on the populations, demographic stresses on Neanderthals in particular, due to the separation between the Eastern and Western populations, due to whatever combination of random genetic or demographic events that led to their decline. We also see the connectivity of the sapien social network as something that could explain the long-term resilience of our species under contrasting climate conditions. So what next? What's the link between climate, habitat suitability, social structure, connectivity, and cultural evolution? We think it lies here, and that's where we're devoting the next stage of our research, a new project that we've started, looking at how we can exploit cumulative cultural evolution theory to examine how the distribution and connectivity of human populations faced with climate change leads to changes in the material culture record and eventually to cultural evolution. A brief note on cumulative culture hypothesis. It's a branch of cultural evolutionary theory. It links population size and the networks of social interaction and degree of interconnectivity to rates of innovation, cultural transmission, and complexity. We feel that this is a good bridge between the more earth sciences oriented species distribution models and more archaeological models that seek to explain cultural evolution. The new project is going to examine the impact of abrupt warming on cultural evolution in late glacial interstadial complex. We're going to look at the impact of mobility and culture, and it's the impact of climate change on mobility and cultural diversity in Europe during the late glacial interstadial. We want to test whether cumulative cultural theory offers a plausible causal mechanism, because that's what tends to be missing in a lot of models that have previously been published, which tend to be adaptationist, to explain how climate-driven changes in the landscape impact population structure and cultural evolution. We're looking forward to interacting with other teams, specifically teams in Europe that are already investigating diachronic and spatial trends in material culture production. The people at Köln, Andreas Meyer's group, and of course, people at Bordeaux. working with Francesco Derrico and company. So that's something that's going to feed the later phases of this long-term research project. And finally, a little word about social relevance of the past, because it's something that we all get asked about if we study the Paleolithic. But I think for the same reason paleoclimatologists study past climate, we're studying past human adaptations. And I think what can we distill from this research? I think a reminder that our survival as a species doesn't just depend on technology, but it also depends on our ability to assess risk, our ability to move about and forge and maintain social bonds across great distances. These strategies today are harder to apply because of administrative, political boundaries, inequalities, conflicts, but people are seeking the same solutions to climate-driven crisis that we always have. We're trying to move to better places, we're trying to reunite with our loved ones, and we're trying to find or forge mutual support networks. So thank you for your attention.